Hello everyone. So we're going to be continuing on with the shading of the shapes. Today's session will be shading the tetrahedron. Some people refer to it as a pyramid. A tetrahedron is a pyramid shape. So I began today's session just very quickly blocking in the triangular shapes. So we have two triangular shapes. So I started with the elements of drawing. So if you recall, you begin with a point. If I remove my point, I leave a mark. But essentially, I used my moving point here. So I began here, moving point, to create line. And creation of this, it's a mark that spans the distance between 2 points. So I used a moving point to create a span between the 2 points. So I came here, and then I came down here, and then I came down here. And then what I did was I closed in this area, and I closed in this area to create shape. So you always want to begin. The elements of drawing are to begin with a point. You use a mark, you use a moving point to create a distance that spans, an area that spans 2 points. And then you enclose that area to create a simplified shape. So I went through each one of those steps, and that's how I came to the situation we're at now, where we have a triangular shape here, we have a triangular shape here. So the next goal, the ultimate goal, is to try to create shape into a three-dimensional form. You can do that with line, but for the purpose of the series that we've been working on, we will use shading to create three-dimensional form. All right. Then using the elements of shading, it's important to note that we have, there are roughly 6 elements, or there are 6 elements of shading. You have the highlight. The highlight is always placed within an area of light. So you have the highlight, then you have light, and then you blend very carefully into the halftone, and then from halftone we go to core shadow, from core shadow to reflected light, and in most cases there is a cast shadow. There are situations where you may not have a cast shadow. So if you don't have a cast shadow, you're only using 5 of the elements of shading, but for the most part, there are 6 elements. So in beginning this very quickly, one thing that I'd like to point out is when you have an area, this is different. It's similar in shape. It started similar in shape to the cone, but the cone was more rounded and the turn was softer. The tetrahedron has a much sharper line. So it comes this way. It has a very distinct plane that comes this way and a very distinct plane that goes this way. That creates a different scenario. So the core shadow, or the darkest dark, is going to fall next to the lightest light. And that's something to remember whenever you do something that has, for example, a 90-degree turn or more. You create this sharp edge, and that sharp edge will be the darkest dark, and next to it will have the lightest light. So for right now, very quickly, I'm going to have my light source coming from this way, from above, and from the left, with the cast shadow falling here to the right. So the light's coming from the left, cast shadow to the right, very much like we read from left to right. So I'm going to put in a halftone. I'm going to block all this in just very quickly, and I'm turning my pencil on the side so I can move shade quicker. And then I'm going to be careful to stay light, keep this kind of light in the beginning, and I want it to get darker as we go. So very quickly, I'm just going to cover all of this with the tone. And so this kind of creates something that's sort of interesting here. So now, in theory, we have this shaded, right? But I like to think that what we've really done is just created, if I put my hand over this side of the triangle there so that we only see this side, now we just have a dark triangle. a triangle that has a darker value in it. If I put my hand on it this side, we have a triangle here that is just a lighter triangle. So it's still relatively flat, although it does create a little bit of the optical illusion that if light's coming from this side, it hits here, all of this is in light, and all of this does fall in shadow because it's absent of light. But now we want to add a core shadow. So the darkest dark should be closest to the lightest light. So right here, right along this plane, I want to further enhance this, and I want it to be darker. So the darkest dark is going to be near the lightest light. So, and I don't want to just make a sharp cut or an edge. I want to blend this carefully. So I'm going to have it, the darkest dark right on the edge, at the top and on the side. But as it moves away, I want the value to get softer because we still need to have reflected light. Light coming from another, reflecting or bouncing off another source onto the side of our tetrahedron. And we want to just, and it's really important that you are careful with how hard you press with your pencil. And what I'd prefer that you not do is use a smudge stick or tissue or something to do your shading, because you're not really truly learning the art of shading. You're just kind of smearing your graphite or your pencil around. So you want to learn the subtlety of using your pencil to create the light and the shadow. And let me open that tone a little bit. But as you can see, we've now got, so now if we put our hand over it, we do see some subtle value in here. We see a little bit of the reflected light. We see the core shadow. So now we have an area of light, we have core shadow, and we have reflected light. What I want to do, because this area would not be entirely light, so even though the light is hitting that side, we'll have a little bit of a halftone. Remember, we want to keep, even in a shape like this, we want to have a situation where the light shows strongest in certain area, but we want to have all the values. We want to keep the light inside the form. We want it to look three-dimensional and sculptural. Unless this just has an incredibly intense light on it and washes everything out, you will still see halftone throughout this. And the highlight tends to not be down here on the bottom, so we'll put a little bit of a halftone on this. And I'm taking great care to make sure that I'm shading in the direction of the plane. So I can go up and down, or I can come directly across. If this is the area of the plane, I want to make sure that I'm shading on that area. And I want to keep it pretty soft. So in some ways, this can be a little bit, it's tricky, but in some ways it can be a little bit easier to shade than, say, the sphere, the cylinder, or the cone, because it's harder to be more subtle when you have something that turns around. This is distinctly sharp, so it goes much quicker. So now from there, we will add a cast shadow. So right here, I want to make sure the light's coming this way. I want to make sure the cast shadow goes through here. So some of the shadow is going to fall behind. All of this plane here, it'll be smaller on the near the corner, and as it'll move away. And remember, the darkest dark is directly near the object. And I'm gonna have this, because we'll be adding the background, so I wanna have the form extend out, but softly become part of the background form so that it has a nice rhythm and a nice flow to it. I'm trying to avoid really sharp edges in the shading here. I want it to have a nice flow to it. So let's cover in a lot of this. And remember, if I make this a certain value, this darker value, it's really important that it be the same value that I have right in here in the core shadow. So if I make this a little darker, I need to make sure that I make this a little bit darker. And then I want it to blend, so I want to make sure that I put a little bit more of a tone now over the reflected light. And as this recedes toward the corner, as it recedes away a little bit, that can be have a little bit more of a darker halftone. And then there will be a little bit of a tone here at the base, because we want this to sit on a surface. So remember, when we add our background, we want to make sure, especially it would be a painting principle, so we want to make sure that every part of this has a tone on it. If we were painting, you wouldn't leave just the white canvas. You would want to have a tone. Okay, so now I'm going to slowly here start adding in all of the background. And I'm going to have it come right up into the edge, because I want to soften the edge here. It's okay if it overlaps a little bit. Put a tone in the foreground because we want to lock the viewer's eye in. Draw all attention that we can to the subject. Same here. And remember to blend this carefully so that you don't see any of the line. You want to just see value. And as you get better at this, you'll learn where to apply a little heavier weight to your pencil if you want to make it darker, and where to just barely touch the surface and hardly use any pressure at all when you want it softer. So now I'll gradually start to darken this in a slightly darker value in the corner, blending carefully toward the object. And shading the background is just a matter of patience. You don't want, if you get in a big hurry, you can really wreck your drawing or take away and distract from the image, because you want your background to enhance your image, not take away from the image. A lot of times I see people that spend hours and hours shading this beautiful core element of their focal point, which in this case would be the tetrahedron, and then they'll haphazardly just throw in a fast, sloppy background, and it kind of wrecks the drawing. So you want to make sure that you put as much care into shading the background as you do into the main object. So let's just get a soft tone here around all the edge of the pyramid. And I'm wanting this pyramid shadow to follow all the way through up into the background so it becomes part of the image as a whole. See if I can quickly get a tone on all this corner. Remember, we want a carefully blended tone over all of this. And then I'll go, once I get all of it covered, then I'll go into certain areas and start to blend it more carefully. And then darken some areas to draw the viewer's attention to where I would like people to be looking. So now we're making progress here on the foreground. And we want to draw the viewer's eye in, so we're just going to keep subtly making the value move toward the image. Now we can start getting this shadow of the pyramid moving up into the background. And let's carefully blend this in toward, we want this moving in toward the pyramid. And I'm trying to be real careful to go side to side across so that it looks like it's sitting on a surface. I treat the tabletop as just an additional plane, another flat two-dimensional plane. Okay, now let's see if we can get this a little bit more. So I want it darker. I want to try to have this dark portion in here, this dark portion in here. I want to try to get that up into these areas. I want to try to enhance the light on the pyramid. We don't want to have the viewer's eye be taken out of the picture plane. We want to lock the viewer's eye into our subject matter, into our focal point. So in this section here, I'm pressing fairly hard. Obviously, you don't want to press so hard you break the point on your pencil. And something that's important to point out that I haven't talked about in the others, but in the case of these, I added a little bit of a border on the outside. If I was doing a finished drawing with the idea of framing it, I definitely would not add a border. Adding borders can end up being kind of a bad idea. When it comes to framing it, if your border's not perfectly straight, it's gonna look silly when you put it in the mat and frame it up. Or you're gonna have to crop your image down to do that. So I recommend never adding borders. I think it's a really bad idea. It's only for the purpose of this demonstration that I wanted to enclose in an area so that you could see the full process. So now we're going to start enhancing this shading through here and enclosing the image a little bit more. Now we can darken this just a little bit more. Try to connect the foreground with the background. And this should start to feel more like it has a cast shadow. And let me just, now that I've been working on that a little bit more, I need to go back and put a little bit more subtlety into this. And I want to try to have a little darker value here on the reflected light area. Push the background behind the pyramid. And then I want to soften the edge, so I'm going to actually include the background right into the reflected light. So I don't care if I'm crossing here because I want to soften the edges. I can always go back and enhance the edge later if I need to. I have a little bit, add a darker line. So having this subtlety and finesse is really important in art. Being able to very carefully and patiently render the image so that it has a nice feeling to it. Okay, so now one thing I want to do here, and I'm using this Tombow Mono Zero eraser, is I'd kind of like to now go in and see if I can soften this. I possibly, when I blocked this in, maybe made this line a little darker than I would have liked. So I'm going to try to soften it. Don't usually like to erase too often, but there's sometimes it, especially when you're trying to kind of clean up a little area where it's really nice to just have this small little eraser to clean a real fine little line. And I'd like to make this just a little softer. But I'm going to go back and add a tone to it in a minute. I want to make sure I keep a half tone on there. And I want to soften the top. I'm going to just give it a slight rounded. And then this will be where we're going to add a highlight in a minute. Highlight's kind of one of the last things that you want to do. In fact, I always, very last thing I do is I always add the highlight. And then if I finish it and I like it, then I'll usually sign it. But that always comes last. So let me as you can see, it's getting softer. Let me just kind of lightly round that corner. And then now lightly add a tone so that it sits on the surface. Now I'll add a little bit of tone to the bottom, put the half tone back in here, add the half tone back here to the edge. And very softly move toward the light. And put a little bit more tone here on the background, coming up to the edge of the pyramid. But it should be starting to look pretty three-dimensional, pretty sculptural. No longer just a flat plane built out of line. So what I'll do now is I'll go ahead and add the highlight. And it's the last thing we do. And then I'll look at it a little bit later and I may touch a few things up and correct it. But that's basically, so the lightest light is going to fall right here next to the darkest dark. So I'm going to have light on this edge. And then it's going to get softer as it moves away. The strongest point is right through here. That's where I want my focal point to be. And then I'm going to make sure that I blend it carefully. I don't want just a big spot. I want it to move away so that it's a recognizable flat plane. Maybe just very slightly put this a little bit of this plane back in. To separate it from the foreground. And put a little tone next to it. And then a little tone next to this base. And that point just a little too dark. Distinctly clarify that point, that plane. Put a slight tone here on the reflected light. Clean up the cast shadow. Remember, right where it touches the surface is where the darkest dark should be. So I want to increase the value there just a little bit. And then as it moves away, it's going to get softer and disappear into the background. This should have a little bit darker area as well. Right in there. So that is more or less, that's the idea of shading the tetrahedron, the pyramid. Remember, we used all the elements of drawing to begin. We started with a mark, or we started with a point, made a mark, then we had a point that moved, moving point, so we created a line, which was a distance that spans 2 points. From the line, we then created a shape. And from shape, the ultimate goal was to create three-dimensional form. So that's where we began with the elements of shading. So we have the highlight. In an area of light, we have the highlight. Then we have halftone. Then we have core shadow. We have reflected light, and we have cast shadow. So we have all the elements of shading represented here. In this particular case, where we had a sharp plane, the lightest light fell next to the darkest dark. Lightest light next to the darkest dark. That's an important thing to remember when you have distinct planes like this. So I hope that you found this helpful and you found it useful. Remember, all these different shapes that we're using in shading to create three-dimensional forms, if you can learn to draw and shade these forms and any variation of these forms, basically there isn't anything that you can't draw or shade. All things that exist in nature are some variation of one of these shapes. and forms. So that concludes this session on drawing the tetrahedron. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.